All right, welcome. Glad to have you here with us today. We are here at the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, and it's a special lecture. This is the final lecture in the summer series of the Herman Bavinck reading group. So this is session 13, the evaluation of the Enlightenment thought and thinkers through the perspective or lens of Dutch Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck and his generous theology. So let's get started here on this evaluation, and I hope you enjoy. All right, we're live, we're online, we're on target, we're looking good, looking better than we have a right to look. But seriously, welcome. It's great to have folks here. My thanks to the folks who have made it through. We're in the 13th session of the Herman Bavinck reading group for the summer of 2020. And so it is really a joy to be at the end of the fourth quarter here, to borrow an analogy, to be right at the end as the game of these series of lectures is finishing up. It's great to have made it here together. Wow, what a ride. It's been an amazing time for me to get the chance to prepare this material and talk it over with you. And so I'd like to say thank you. All of you who have participated have spurred me onto heights that I had not achieved but previously, as well as an understanding of this really crucial time that has really blossomed. I am so grateful and thankful to be able to go over these resources and this excellent material with you. So if it's all right, I'd like to open us up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, honor and glory to you, Lord God. Thank you for this series of lectures. Thank you for my friends, Lord, who have come. And I pray for their blessing, and I pray for their good. Lord, thank you for this material. It has been a joy to study it together and to go over so much of what has made these past few centuries interesting and relevant for the times we live in today. Above all, Lord, I pray that you would guide us in goodness and in wholesomeness. Lord, let good things, clean things, honorable things come from my mouth. Keep me from sin and error and presumption. Lord, let me speak charitably and generously, but also accurately and faithfully. Lord, I pray for each person on here and those watching lectures online, Lord, that you would be with them, that this material would be a blessing to them and their understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I would like to just do a brief reading from Psalm chapter 96. Psalm chapter 96. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name. Proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among the peoples. For great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and glory are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Amen. All right. So again, my thanks to each of you. Thank you for joining. It is a real pleasure to be here. And let me just take a brief second here to make an adjustment. All right. And just like to welcome each of you here. Tonight, we're really going to go out, through an evaluation. So it's going to be a bit of a retrospective. So these are the final thoughts after 12 weeks of study. Next slide. What I'd like to stress, first of all, is the key role that Herman Bavinck's theology plays in these series of discussions. So in all of these topics, I found Bavinck to be more than capable and more than able to act as a healthy and helpful sounding board for understanding and putting into perspective, I should say putting into right perspective, so much of what has happened during his lifetime and during the Enlightenment. So Bavinck really is, his theology really anchors down a profitable exploration of this period of time. And I can really think of no better person in Reformed theology to sort of have and use as a guide to framing and understanding the issues of the Enlightenment. And so even though there's not necessarily an explicit picture of Bavinck on every slide or explicit quotes from his Reformed dogmatics on each of these slides, we've gone over the quotes in previous sessions, and the context is there. And the narrative framing and the way that Bavinck has pieced together the right way, an edifying way to look at this time period and these issues is fabulous, and it's so helpful. I've, in my own mind, titled Herman Bavinck's theology as a generous one, a generous theology, or a charitable theology, because of the care he took in analyzing these issues and the way he did his best to be faithful and to be accurate in representing even his opponents. And so let's just start through with our evaluation, and not in any particular order. Here we'll just go through some major themes of the Enlightenment. And so when I think about this lecture series and some of the things that have sort of come to our awareness, one of the things that's most obvious to me is Enlightenment thinking as a process of rejection. So whatever Enlightenment thinking is, and at times it's hard to pin Enlightenment thinking down to any particular this or that or ism or school of thought. But one thing that was sort of almost universal through the Enlightenment, I say almost because it wasn't completely, but yet the main currents of the Enlightenment were a rejection of classical or traditional categories of dogmas. So the whole way that reality was conceived by the classicists, the classical theists, the traditional Christian orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy of the monotheistic religions in the West, it's all called into place, called into question, and rejected wholesale. So whatever you did in the Enlightenment, in a very important and general way, anything you would do would be acceptable so long as it was not what came before. So in that sense, Enlightenment thinking was very inclusive in that it allowed for almost anything, but it was very exclusive in that it explicitly excluded Christian orthodoxy or the traditional or classic categories of dogma. And we see here the intensification of investigations of the inner being. And here we're referring to the inner landscape of the human psyche. So the field today we know of as psychology is largely an Enlightenment innovation. The intensification of vocational specialties and their effect on public perception of religion and the clergy. And in particular, for the secularist, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. So prior to the Enlightenment, as a general rule, the clergy and the lay people related to each other in a way that was quite inverted or quite changed during the Enlightenment years. And so in the pre-Enlightenment, it was very common for the clergy to be among the highest educated people in that society. And there was a large delta, there was a large gap between the average person, the average lay person, and most clergy members. So clergy was almost a higher form, a higher caste or category, if you want to look at it that way. Now, during the Enlightenment, this inverted and this changed so that the lay people who were so significantly undereducated with respect to the clergy prior to the Enlightenment, the situation switched. And during the Enlightenment, the clergy became, in some senses, no better educated than the average vocational specialist. And so here, think about the specialist in terms of having professions like physician or lawyers or industrialists or mathematicians or philosophy professors, these specialized domains of expertise where the lay people were quite educated and quite well accomplished in their domain. And as they became educated on a level similar to that of the clergy, the mystique was largely tempered. And the lay people began to largely see the clergy as not anything special. The emperor is not wearing any clothes, meaning that the physician of the time or the industrialist of the time or the philosopher of the time saw himself as an intellectual equal to the clergy. And when he saw the universe differently than the person in the pulpit, by and large, it was the case that why should the clergyman's opinion on such matters be any better than his own? And so that's very much come into play and into reaction here. And it's come down to the present day. So, even to this day, there are very many people who are as well educated, if not more educated, than the typical clergy, typical pastors, typical people who serve in the church. And because of that, this mystique of knowledge, this special knowledge, is lessened. It is quite common to view the domains of theology as personal playthings. And by that I mean you have your theology, I have mine, almost as if they are opinions, and one opinion is just as valid as another. And so this greatly reduced, quote unquote, the power of the clergy and their effect and influence in society. Next slide. So early on in the Enlightenment period, we could see the main themes of Kant and the new philosophy, Kant's reinvention of the science of metaphysics. We could see, starting with Kant, but not exclusively with him, the rejection of specific forms of dogma. Now, some qualification is needed here because there was, of course, a total rejection of dogma in the works of Kant and other intellectuals of this early Enlightenment period time. However, throughout the Enlightenment period, it became clear and obvious that lots of dogma was okay. In fact, it was only the pre-Enlightenment or traditional Christian or monotheistic categories that were harmful dogma. And this came about because all of these Enlightenment thinkers applied their intellect to the problems of metaphysics, the problems of ontology and epistemology, and realized that important frameworks needed to be in place that could not be demonstrated, could not be proved, but yet these frameworks were presupposed. And so the dogma that the anti-dogmatists hated in Christianity and in early pre-Enlightenment forms of thought, they smuggled back in, only it was their dogma on the back end. Now, after Kant, we had Hegel, and the move toward the unifying system, the unity of plurality, or the plurality of a unity, e pluribus unum, the attempt to bring together the idea of the one thing along with the idea of the many things in a harmonious fashion. And Hegel's key insight here was his use of the dialectic, a process of reasoning that started with a synthesis, that started with a thesis, interacted with the antithesis, and then a synthetic step or a synthesis between those two steps resulted in a new, more systematic approximation to reality and truth, or at least that was the intention. Now, by the time we get here to the middle portion of the Enlightenment, we already see the beginnings of things like, for example, Karl Marx and the idea of the People's Revolution, as well as Nietzsche and the absurd, the existential situation that humankind faces, as well as even on the Christian side, writers like Kierkegaard offered an idea of the crisis of faith. Next slide. And so these themes developed and intensified and turned into new things throughout the Enlightenment. So Kant started off the Enlightenment by thinking one way, but almost from the beginning, thinkers took his concepts in directions he perhaps never anticipated and into new areas. And so each generation built upon or rejected or modified some aspect of his thinking to the point where it would be difficult in some cases to even relate that later thought back to Kant. So, however, a few ideas were very clear. First of all was this primacy and this intensification of criticism and skepticism. So the tool of rejecting pre-Enlightenment thought was, in fact, to use doubt, to use the skeptical method, to criticize as if one were performing an autopsy of belief and finding the conclusions that the old, dead, dry orthodoxy had come to, finding them lifeless, unsatisfying, untrue, and dependent upon supernatural categories. Also, we have the theme of the alienation of the human condition and the absurdity. So humankind is not simply neutral in the world and doesn't particularly have a good interaction with reality, but is in fact thrown, as some of the existentialists have noted, into the world like a dog without a bone. Ideas of resentment and contempt came about as the Industrial Revolution swept through and statuses and roles were undermined, classical forms changed as a result of the process of urbanization, of the process of industrial development. People who were from the lower castes or from the lower parts of society just a few generations ago found themselves in the upper part of society and looking down or looking with contempt upon those who got there by autocratic means or by the good old pre-Enlightenment virtue of having inherited their position. And so you have this class warfare. You have an intensification of the debate that presumed science and religion to be incompatible. You also have the new university and the humanities, and those can be summed up as the exile of theology as the queen of the sciences and replaced by philosophy. And finally, on the political side, you had the French revolutions and the political outworking of secular principles. So, next slide. taking these influences a little bit further, some of the personalities that we looked at had great influence into some of the personalities in the 20th century. So people like Sigmund Freud, who took the science of psychology that Nietzsche, in a sense, claimed to have invented, and took it and developed it to a new level and made it the centerpiece of his thought and the centerpiece of the turn to the phenomenal. You also had other examples, folks like Piaget, developmental psychologist, greatly influenced by Kant. You had Carl Jung, who was influenced by Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or Schiller. Even down to contemporary times, for example, Jordan Peterson, even to this day, has been greatly influenced by Carl Jung and Nietzsche. And then finally, even in the realm of Reformed orthodoxy, of which Bavinck was a major figure at this time, we see coming just in the generation after Bavinck, we see Karl Barth and the Swiss movement, this turn towards what would eventually be called a neo-orthodoxy, or a new form of orthodoxy. And Barth was greatly influenced by Kierkegaard positively, and greatly influenced by Friedrich Schleiermacher on the negative side of things. So what an important time this was, and the influences that came through here were amazing. These were just absolutely a critical time period. Next slide. We talked a little bit earlier about an intensification of new fields. So although hermeneutics and the study of narrative were by no means first invented during the Enlightenment period, they in fact existed prior to it, but their study was intensified as people called traditional categories, traditional hermeneutics, traditional ideas of narrative and meaning into question. And so there became a great disjunction between what is, from an ontological basis, and what it means. So reality versus the human understanding of reality. And this is, of course, the important separation between the ontological and the epistemological. This was largely driven by the idea of perspective and the human agency, the turn to the phenomenological. Remember, we looked at Fichte and his partitioning in line with Kant of reality into the I and the not I. So this man-centered, humanistic-centric understanding of reality. Now, earlier, of course, we talked about Kant and his importance and Kant's partitioning of reality into the noumenal and the supernatural. But what we see is over time, these categories became emptied as thinkers willfully and on purpose excluded noumenal and supernatural categories from their systems of philosophy. And at first it was just a humble attempt to limit their inquiry to the subset of reality that could be scientifically demonstrated, or put another way, phenomenologically shown to be true. However, over time, these thinkers lost that modesty, lost that humility, and started to simply treat reality as if only what was phenomenal was actually in existence. And finally, as we mentioned earlier, this was the time of the specialist and the professional, the educated man. And especially in the 18th or 19th century, it was generally men who were in these specialty fields. It's probably only in this century that, in fact, it has extended also to an even greater degree to include women. Next slide. Of course, one cannot overstate the influence of Immanuel Kant. He is, in some sense, a singular giant of the Enlightenment. He sought to reinvent metaphysics. He largely succeeded. It's hard to overstate the importance and influence of his work and of his thought. He was his partitioning of reality into noumenal and phenomenal. And as we mentioned earlier, the later thinkers, especially the secular thinkers, under the guise of limiting inquiry to what could be measured or observed, that is, the phenomenal, tended to minimize or empty or eliminate the noumenal. Now, this is not only true of the later thinkers in the secular arm, but also true of Christian thinkers from the Protestant liberalism school. So we'll talk more about that. Next slide. Now, this didn't just happen overnight, and in fact, it might be argued that this could not have happened with the institutions in their pre-Enlightenment forms. So a key for this happening to occur was for the new university to appear on the scene and facilitate the separation between the humanities and the sciences from the theological. Now, we have to be generous to some degree here, for much of this was progress. It was clearly bad science for people to think at one time that, for example, rotting meat would grow maggots because of some spiritual force or some supernatural demon or some unexplained mythical being acting to do that, versus simply flies coming and laying eggs in the rotting meat and the larvae feasting on them. So there was progress in the separation that needs to be acknowledged. However, much of this was also declension. Much of this was also a regression or a step backwards. The cancerous, aggressive criticism and demagogy of Christian and other pre-Enlightenment modes of thought was incessant. And we read ourselves how the Enlightenment thinkers would not even entertain to deal with Christian categories as one might critically deal. So, for example, rather than deal with Christian concepts of sin and the anthropological condition of humankind, most Enlightenment thinkers just rejected the concept and proceeded as if it was not even there in the marketplace of ideas. In effect, this was perhaps an early form of cancel culture. Now, it didn't help that several early figures of the new university were persecuted. So, we noted that several of the early thinkers, I believe it was Schelling, Strauss, and Marx, if I'm not mistaken, were persecuted, were forced to flee the country because in publishing their ideas, the authorities went after them. However, the idea of tolerance that was so highly promoted in the universities, in the humanities, as we have seen in recent years, has turned out to be deeply flawed and largely contradictory. From the beginning, the new humanities departments were at ideological odds or warfare with the traditional categories of thought. Next slide. And so we had sort of these three kings of the Enlightenment. Now it's really tough to narrow down to just three. The Enlightenment is so filled with amazing thinkers and schools of thought that this is an arguable point all day. But for our purposes, Kant, whom we talked about earlier, absolutely critical. Hegel gave us the idea of this dialectic step and this idea of a systematic and positivistic approach to religious knowledge. And finally, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who had the idea that religion could not be summarily understood by appealing to scriptures or written writings of old, but instead one appealed to an intuition of self that saw the universe as a whole, and the self feeling of being at one with it as the guiding principle. And so we saw in the Christology of a Protestant liberalism that Jesus is not God by nature, but is rather or merely the fullest instance of graced humanity. We also saw in Protestant liberalism the presumption that much of the Bible was in fact error-prone, and just plain outright wrong. And so much of liberal theology was devoted to refactoring the truths of Christianity out from under their scriptural underpinnings. And so that led to, for example, the great controversy in the 1920s between the fundamentalists and the liberals, which largely resulted in the abandonment by most Protestant denominations of classical creeds and confessions and standards that emphasized the foundation of Christianity as being the Holy Scriptures. And of course, one of the great regrets I have in these series of lectures was not giving time to Charles Darwin to look at his thought, to understand his role and what he performed and accomplished during this time period. It is perhaps no overstatement to say that Darwin was a slayer of Christian hegemony. As H.L. Mencken wrote in his preface to the Antichrist, writing about Nietzsche, although he had Darwin in mind, Mencken noted that within a few years after Darwin's Origin of the Species, it was a shameful thing for one of the elite, for one of the intellectual elite or academic elites or ruling elite to believe in the unbelievable doctrines of Christianity. And so what an important role he played. Next slide. So we took a look at Feuerbach, who is a great example of a person who emptied theology of its supernatural and noumenal content in favor of a humanistic kind of religion. So we had a quote from him: "The purpose of my books is to transform theologians into anthropologists, lovers of God into lovers of man, candidates for the next world into students of this world, religious and political flunkies of heaven and earthly monarchs into the lords of free and self-reliant citizens of the earth." So we saw how he viewed God as an anthropological construct and the exaltation of science as a higher form of thinking than religion. We saw his idea that in explaining religion, it was nothing more than people projecting their own ego outward onto reality and making God from it. So religion as a human egoism, faith as narcissism. And so just along the same lines as Voltaire, Feuerbach was convinced that religion was something humankind would grow out of as people progressed. Just as one grew out of an old set of clothes into a new set of clothes, so too Feuerbach thought people would grow out of their primitive thinking in Christianity and grow into the new humanism. Next slide. In the same lines, we took a look at Strauss, and Strauss's approach was to presuppose a secular phenomenology. That is to say, he rejected Christian frames of context and reference. He emptied reality of the supernatural, not because it was disproved, but because that which was not scientific or phenomenal could be dismissed from his thinking. So now people, in his view, are enlightened in their faculties. And it is only now, in the light of this new inner light, that the current generation can truly start to search for the genuine or true historical Jesus. But since the supernatural was rejected as an a priori condition of Strauss's thought, then he could not possibly find a historical Jesus he could not find a historical Jesus who was supernatural or divine. And this is by virtue of the fact that his search was limited so as to exclude such parameters. And as he said in The Life of Jesus, he says, the Bible mythos presents in two places. A, it is not history, and B, it is fiction. So Christianity is true up until the point where it's false because it's not history, and B, it's fiction. In other words, it's not true, is what he meant to say. Next slide. Of course, we took a look at Karl Marx. Marx saw himself as a man of action in a way that previous people were not. So he famously said, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. He thought religion was the opiate of the masses. He thought that human beings manifested who they were and what they were about in their social interactions. In other words, sociology is not merely a psychology. You cannot take human beings in isolation and understand what they are. You can only truly understand what they are by seeing them interact socially. He saw communism as the appropriate synthesis of capitalism and socialism. He advocated for the redistribution of wealth, and he noticed that this was only accomplished by a solidarity. And by that solidarity, he meant that the have-nots would have to use compelling force to redistribute wealth from the haves. That is to say, since wealth transfer doesn't willingly happen, a period of authoritarian despotism, in his view, was a necessary step to establish socialist utopia by any means necessary. Next slide. And then finally, we came to perhaps the most profane thinker of this Enlightenment period, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, he absolutely and unapologetically positions his philosophy as a devouring antithesis of Christianity. He welcomes the title of Antichrist. He is an anti-systematician, and while he affirms particular truths, he rejects universal truths or narratives. In his thinking, intellectual inquiry is always perspectival, never objective in the sense of pre-Enlightenment or classic thought. Ultimately, in his thinking, it was the task of the Superman, of the Übermensch, of the enlightened being, to lead his or herself into their own generation of truth and narrative. So the ultimate meaning and purpose for reality is not present in reality of itself, but it was a duty of the enlightened thinker, Nietzsche thought, to generate their own absolute truth and narrative, their own story about what reality was and why it was there and what was their role in it. Next slide. Now we move to a very sort of unusual representation here. We've looked and focused so much on the secular arm of the Enlightenment, but in fact, there were developments even within the Christian arm of the Enlightenment. We talked about Schleiermacher. In addition to Schleiermacher, perhaps by far the most obvious example of Enlightenment Christian thinking came from Kierkegaard. Through his tools, his ideas and senses of the dramatic, his use of irony, his embrace of perspectivalism, and his understanding of the three spheres of human existence, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. He portrayed the human condition as being absurd and filled with existential angst, which came from, indeed, in his own thinking, the very original sin from Adam and Eve. And here, his thought was very crucial in establishing a transition or a change in the definition and way of thinking that faith was spoken of. Prior to the Enlightenment, the Anselmian way of looking at faith was very much the default way of thinking. And in this thinking, it was faith seeking understanding. Christianity was the great rational, reasonable step for pre-Enlightenment thought to be built upon. However, instead, secular thinkers and even Kierkegaard, as a Christian thinker, here changes the debate, changes the definition and understanding of faith from the Anselmian way into this great leap into the infinite unknown. And so the secular thinkers of the Enlightenment, and even Kierkegaard himself, although not necessarily Christian orthodoxy, interpreted this understanding of faith as a very unreasonable irrationalism. One comes to the edge of a cliff, and one must step off it and walk across to the other side. Does that sound like a reasonable and rational way to approach life? Well, of course it didn't. Kierkegaard didn't intend it to. However, this dynamic changed. And today, it's very difficult to find a critic of Christianity who will understand faith in the Anselmian sense. Instead, it's always this appeal to the irrational. And so, thank you, Kierkegaard, I guess. If we were to criticize, this might be an example of declension. I don't think this Kierkegaard's idea of faith here does any great help to advancing the kingdom. Next slide. There's so much more to speak about, and I wish we had maybe 100 more lectures to go over things together. But the truth is, this has been a very successful survey, but it's only been a survey. Bavinck was a great anchor here, and I would recommend and commend him for, as a dogmatic anchor for any of the periods of time that he wrote about, for his theology is mature and careful and charitable and a great blessing and benefit. What are we to say as Christians or believers about the Enlightenment? Well, if I'm going to employ my own dialectical statement here, I'm going to take it from Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. There was much progress. Many things moved forward. However, perhaps just as many regressed or went downwards. In some sense, in many senses, the Enlightenment has been a descent into madness and darkness. Primarily the madness of humanism and the darkness of secularism. It should be no surprise to the student of history that the French Revolution was perhaps merely a precursor to where Enlightenment thinking would go, and the ideas of Nietzsche and Marx would have grave authoritarian consequences in the 20th century. The communistic revolutions across the world, starting in Russia, moving to China, but affecting almost every continent, has to be counted as among the greatest disasters of all human history. And it is not being partisan or ugly to note that Nietzsche's philosophy was not in any sense directly responsible for the Third Reich and the actions of the people involved in it. However, indirectly, it was absolutely a tremendous and important influence on that great evil. And so we see that even to this day, and even in this nation, in this time period, our society flirts with two different, wildly different views about what life should be like. And what will happen in this next round of thinking and these next communist revolutionary steps, only God knows. However, if you had to place money, it would be a pretty safe bet to put down that wherever socialism gets the upper hand, authoritarianism cannot be far behind. And so this has been a wonderful journey into the Enlightenment, and I have been so blessed by it. I want to thank each of you. Thank you for supporting me in these lectures. Let's open up for questions and discussion points. And also, I'd love to ask if anybody would like to share their own thoughts about these lectures, or the most important principles that you took away in our discussions, or perhaps your own favorite personalities. So I'm going to open it up here. Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to jump in. So, as far as favorite personalities, I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite, but I think in thinking about some of these thinkers, um, and by the way, I think you summed up fairly well, kind of the thesis of all of these lectures that you've done. When I think through these, first of all, I think it's really important. As you pointed out, there are some really key thinkers during this time, and you hit on most of them. I think you regretted that you couldn't get to Darwin, um, and Darwin certainly is important. But I also think that there is a case to be made that um, Darwin couldn't have existed without some of these others that we've talked first coming along. Um, but it's really important to understand where a lot of these guys are coming from. And so for me, I really appreciate the time that we've spent going through a lot of these thinkers and thinking about them and reading through some of them as we've done, both in the light of Bavinck's uh, uh, discussions, because certainly in his both in his ethics and in his dogmatics volumes, he really gets at a lot of these issues. So it's really important to understand them in that light and to see what Bavinck is reacting to. Um, but it's also important, really, because there is a sense in which there's a lot in what we believe today that are as a result of these thinkers. Now, we may not, modern thinkers may not agree always with each of these thinkers, but somebody like Kant, for example, really is sort of a major stream of where a lot of modern thought has gone, and even where some of these others that have come after, like Hegel and Marx, have often disagreed with Kant on things. It took Kant to actually deal with some of these issues, and there's so much in the way that we think, not just in academic circles, but really just everyday thought that really begins out of this era. So I think I really appreciate your bringing it up. I do say that I would say that there some of the thinkers I'm more negative on, and others I'm perhaps less negative on. I'm still really interested and plan on doing some more reading in Kierkegaard, because I think there's something there. Not necessarily that we would turn Kierkegaard into our we wouldn't replace our systematic theologies with Kierkegaard by any means, nor do I think he would ever want us to. But there's something really important there that I think I'd like to dive into a little bit more deeply. And I also think too, people like the last couple of weeks we spent some time with Marx and Hegel as well, and it's really important to understand them. I think I've maybe mentioned here, and I know I've mentioned to you as well, um, that I think that, especially with Marx, there is a sense in which if we really understand Marx, that probably is helpful in dealing with people who think they're Marxist. Because Marx, absolutely, Marx dealt with certain problems that were existent in his day and age that are still existent today, and he dealt with them in a certain way. And I don't think that everyone who's always um, enamored with Marx really understands where he ended up. They see a few of the pieces of it and are sort of attracted to some of the answers. But if they would realize how much that he really believed in he didn't believe in justice. He didn't believe in sort of an ethical standard at all, and I think that needs to be understood. And Hegel, I think when we talked, um, he's a little harder for me to deal with because I'm not sure that there's as many people who are openly um, sort of not Hegel, Nietzsche. I don't think there's as many people who sort of as openly, enamored. with Nietzsche, but yet he is important, and a lot of people do read him, or at least read about him. So it's important to understand that. So all that was just a really long way of saying, hey, this was great.
Thank you.
I'll go next. Thank you. I liked when you said you're less negative on Kierkegaard. I'd written those exact words down when you said it. I don't know that I'm quite as eager to get into all that he's written, maybe as you have, but I was I generally had him as a largely oppositional thinker primarily, but it was there was more interest there. In reading more. I have some of his works. I've not made it through all of them. Couple things. These are a bunch of different thoughts. Feel free to jump in on them. Anyone. You mentioned the trifecta, the three kings, Kant, Hegel, and Schleiermacher, and it was interesting in a way how you didn't have Marx, Darwin, or Nietzsche as part of that, maybe because of their timing and where they were. But I also am wondering about some of the implications, like Marx is the practical side of man of action, right? It's not just to be introspective or to think about it, but to make changes. And this will be a bit of a rambling. Hopefully I can tie it off in a thought, is that I'm not sure if it's Francis Schaeffer who said this, or others may have said this as well. It's if there's any compromise in the dogma or in thinking, it usually flows from the church to the university to the broader population, or at least maybe that's how it had worked, that there was almost a permission given to to compromise on the resurrection of Christ, or the Bible is God's word, not just a helpful story. If that was the case, is that still the case, or is it now the university to the population with a feedback loop to the church, that the church adapts to it, or at least in, I guess, some of the more liberal theologian oriented churches take their cue from the populace rather than from revelation. I don't know if that gets us too far afield from enlightenment, but those were some of the things I was thinking about today as we did the survey. I found this survey at the end, this evaluation, really helpful in starting to button down how some of these pieces fit together. And I wouldn't be against you putting another one of these, an evaluation with charts of how all these things fit together, that you've done on some slides. But I know that's a little much, but this has been helpful. But I didn't know if you had any comments on the either the three kings, or the three workmen, I guess, Marx, Darwin, and Nietzsche. And then the other thing that I wanted to comment on later is this has really helped me understand my father much more too, from his background. But any.
No, that's awesome. Let me just say, first of all, thank you, because that was huge. And actually, you talking about your father was one of the key insights that came to me that I hadn't put together. This idea that postmodernism is to modernism what modernism was to pre-modernism, or the pre-Enlightenment thinking. This destroyer, this idea of whatever you are, I'm against, and I'm going to strike out into this new uncharted world without your interpretive grid. And it made me think about what is it that had happened to so turn people off. It's a really big deal to throw off an interpretive grid or to throw off these ideas of narrative and storytelling that we have about reality, the ideas of meaning and purpose and origin. There is an extreme form of alienation when one generation says to another, however I want to see reality, I don't want to see it through the lens of your understanding. And in that sense, alienation is one of the hugest issues in the human condition that the Enlightenment brought up. Let me go back to say something about the three kings. I struggled so much with this because there were so many possible kings. For a while, I really did have Marx and Nietzsche in with Kant. So if I remade the list, I could have just as easily have gone with Kant, Marx, and Nietzsche as the three kings. And I went with Hegel and Schleiermacher for their foundational. Marx was Hegelian and took it to the level that he did, precisely because Hegel had laid the groundwork. And then the same thing for Nietzsche. And in that sense, it's so hard to pick and choose. So I would completely, if other folks made sort of their own different top three, that would be very valid and a very arguable point. As far as where the church's position is, the church's position is really out. We see, for example, in our culture today, any expression of traditional values is branded as, hate speech. It's branded as homophobia, as racism, as colonialism, as patriarchy. I mean, pick a word. If it sticks and if it has stigma, the postmodernists and the socialists of today will use that. And there's largely a rejection that is based on optics and tone. So when you dig into socialist arguments, you find they're largely built, and this is not an accident. Nietzsche himself said this. Marx also understood these concepts of resentment and contempt. How dare you have something that I don't have, is very much what's happening in the thought processes of these people who see these levels of injustice. And the Bible says, who can stand before envy? And the idea is that few, if any, can stand. There's almost no going back. Revolution, or at least maybe let me not say revolution, civil strife and civil war are really the natural outworkings. And it's not clear that they can be avoided. Now, this is not what I wish for. This is not what I would hope for. And I would really hope that we could write a new chapter of history in which we avoided civil war. But it's absolutely difficult to avoid war when every aspect of the engagement is violent. So think of what's happening in the nation today. Statutes broken, violence in the streets, burning, pillaging, all of these extreme forms of aggression. And there's a lose-lose scenario presented to the traditionalists. If the traditionalists go out and engage with these rioters, they'll be arrested and they'll be locked up. There was a big mural painted in one city of graffiti on the roadway. However, when the ideology from the traditional categories was painted as graffiti over top of that mural, those people were arrested. There's a crackdown on churches meeting and worshiping in some of our states, where there's discriminatory statements by government officials that churches can't meet, and at the same point in time, a commendation of support for these socialist elements. And so, really, who can avoid this? I mean, I don't want to go there, but at the same point in time, if the thing is pressed, there's absolutely no give or take to be had when one side is not in the mood to give or take. And I'm not trying to be partisan, and I'm not trying to just portray a complicated situation in an overly reduced fashion. But really, this is your this is your next door neighbor burning your house down and then calling you a bigot if you try to put the fire out. And how is that going to end well for those of us trying to live in this house? So that's kind of my thought, and I apologize it was so long, about what you said with Francis Schaeffer. I would say the church is out, and it will not ever come back in except and unless by a supernatural move of God. But I think that's not okay, but that's, in a sense, kind of how it always is. That's sort of the history of the world. And it's what's happened in the Enlightenment here is just one more example of it. And we believers are maintained only through the strength and refuge of our God, and not through the wit of our arguments or the force of our arms, although we may employ either of those. So it's a very dire situation, I think. I don't know if I would have said 15 or 20 years ago, had this conclusion about the Enlightenment, but today it seems very natural to equate the discord and the strife as the fruit of these period of 200 years or so. So that was a long response there. How close did I get in answering some of your concerns?
That was very good. You're excluding the church. I think that, from I think Schaeffer goes from, now it flows from university to the general population, versus some of the other methods of, I guess it depends what you're talking about, certain types of thinking or compromise on theology, or what flows into what becomes acceptable in society, or where there's the big debates in society that happened in the universities earlier, and in a number of churches, perhaps prior to that. And there's a past give. So I don't know. You gave some. It was a good answer, and you gave some good thought. The only other thing that I wanted to say was about my father, who this idea of the exclusion or rejection of certain things. There's certain things that don't enter his thought. He doesn't consider it. This I don't know if you call it a dichotomy or split between the noumenal and the phenomenal. He wouldn't consider anything that would be considered supernatural, or I don't know if I dropped or not, but he just wouldn't consider those things. I think you provided a good basis for why he thinks that. So.
Right. No, you're on. Now, who are some other people who we would like to have spent more time with, or maybe discussed? I mentioned Darwin. Is there anybody who we really missed and who we had an opportunity to go further into that maybe we ought to try to look at for the future? Do either of you have an idea?
I don't.
Yeah, and I would say that while there are other people from this era that are interesting, it tends to be, for me, some of the people who are opposed to the general direction, and so have been sort of interesting people to consider, who've answered back, who've been oppositional to it. And so I know you and I have talked a little bit about Reed, and I think there are others as well. I when it comes to the sort of the political side of things, some of the French Catholic thinkers are interesting. I think I can't think of his name now. The English guy. I can't think of the name right now, and it'll come to me probably right as soon as we disconnect. But it tends to be those kinds of people who sort of reacted against a lot of this, and to try to gather whether where some of that, whether is there some sense in which those oppositional figures could still be useful today in dealing with some of these issues. That would be where some of my interest is. And I did remember Edmund Burke is
Yes, yes. That's who I was wondering if you were thinking of.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to point something out here that was really a shock to me. Before you and I started working through the volume that we're using, this Cambridge History of Philosophy for the 19th century. Before that, whenever I read Enlightenment thinkers talking about their past, I was surprised at how almost entirely absent their writings were of any serious opposition. The French response to the philosophes. That was hard to say. Philosophes, the common sense school, and when there was mention of opposition, the primary tactics were ad hominem and bulverism, and that was very telling to me. The more I see that, the more I have come to see the obviously secular arm of the Enlightenment as itself to be nothing more than just outright unbelief. And these folks who, in my own circles, had sort of great cachet as being the most intellectual thinkers of all, now look partisanly ugly. And Herman Bavinck is a big reason why. Also, that 19th century philosophy work we were looking at also gave me more ammunition that there's something larger here. And I really wish to emphasize that. For me, I thought this before the lecture series, but everything through the lecture series seemed to sort of strengthen it. I see the French, excuse me, I see the French Revolution and Marx's turn to the authoritarian as really the only secular options. The secular Enlightenment political thought doesn't really ever present us with any other way to their utopias. So we might get different forms of utopia, we might get different ideals, but at the end of the day, it's plain old Marxism. There's going to be this will this will to power from those who have not, to forcibly take and redistribute and claim what is theirs from those who have. And they do it by means of dictatorship, revolution, and authoritarianism. And you mentioned earlier that it's not clear that many people today who call themselves Marxists or socialists actually understand that that is an explicit step in the communist revolution and in the steps of Marxism and socialism. It's not an accidental thing that the turn to the authoritarian happens. It's in fact explicitly part of it, and that is the cleansing step, the purging step. And I see that as its fundamental, fatal flaw to a freedom-loving people. So there's that.